You need to be out of this house by tomorrow morning. My daughter-in-law told me less than an hour after we buried my son. I was still wearing the same black wool coat from the cemetery, the one that smelled faintly of cold air and lilies, when Lily turned to me in the hallway and said it as calmly as if she were reminding me to take out the trash. The house was quiet in that unnatural way it becomes after a funeral. When the casseroles have been set on the kitchen counter, the last neighbor has offered a stiff hug, and the door finally closes. I had just placed Daniel's framed photograph on the mantel, the one taken on his 40th birthday, his arm around me, both of us squinting in the summer sun. I remember staring at that picture while her words settled over me, slow and heavy. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her, trying to understand how grief could look so different on two people standing only 3 feet apart. "This is my home now, Margaret," she continued, smoothing down the sleeve of her black dress. "Daniel wanted me to move forward. I can't do that with you here." There was no tremor in her voice. No hesitation. Only decision. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not sharp, not loud, but final. For 45 years I had been someone's wife, someone's mother. First Thomas, then Daniel. I had lived in this house for over 2 decades, ever since Daniel insisted I move in after his father passed. "You'll never be alone again, Mom," he had said, carrying my boxes up the front steps himself. I could still see him that day, sweat on his brow, smiling as if the future were something steady and certain. Now the same front steps felt unfamiliar beneath my feet. Lily walked past me into the kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors. Daniel had refinished himself one summer. I followed more slowly. The dining table was still scattered with sympathy cards. A bouquet of white roses leaned slightly to one side in a crystal vase. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, though no one was drinking it anymore. "You have your Social Security," she said over her shoulder. "There are plenty of senior apartments in town. I'm sure you'll find something suitable." Suitable. The word echoed in my mind. I thought of the mornings Daniel and I shared coffee at this very table, the way he would read the newspaper out loud to me when my eyes were tired, the way he insisted on fixing the loose railing by the staircase because he worried I might trip. I thought of the hospital room just 3 days ago, the steady beeping of machines, his hand warm in mine. He had squeezed my fingers before he drifted off, and I had leaned close, whispering that I was right there. I had promised him I would be all right. I had not realized that being all right would mean standing in my own home while being told to leave it. I removed my glasses and folded them carefully, placing them on the kitchen counter beside the stack of condolence envelopes. "I see," I said quietly. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. Lily paused, perhaps expecting an argument, perhaps even hoping for one. Instead, there was only the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the lawn Daniel used to mow every Saturday, exactly 2.5 inches high because he liked it neat. I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself, not from weakness but from the weight of the moment. Less than an hour after we laid my son in the ground, I was being erased from the life we had built together. And yet, beneath the grief, beneath the shock, something else began to take shape inside me, quiet and deliberate. I had learned long ago that silence can be more powerful than protest. So I nodded once, as if accepting instructions, and turned toward the staircase, already knowing that this conversation was not the end of my place in this house, no matter how quickly she believed she could rewrite it. That night, I did not pack a single box. I closed the bedroom door softly behind me and sat on the edge of the bed where I had slept for the past 7 years, ever since Daniel insisted I move into the larger room with the east-facing window, because he said the morning light would be good for my mood. The house felt different now, not louder, not quieter, just altered, as if the walls themselves were listening. I ran my fingers over the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, remembering the afternoon Daniel helped me carry it upstairs, joking that at 71 I should not be lifting anything heavier than a grocery bag. The memory rose gently, without tears. Grief had settled into something heavier than crying. It was a presence, steady and constant. From downstairs I could hear Lily moving through the kitchen, the opening and closing of cabinets, the low hum of her voice as she spoke on the telephone. I could not make out her words, only the tone. It was efficient, organized, not broken. I removed my coat and hung it carefully in the closet, smoothing the collar as if it mattered. The scent of the funeral flowers still clung to the fabric. On the dresser sat a small wooden box that held Daniel's childhood drawings, stick figures of our family standing under a bright yellow sun. I opened it and traced one crayon line with my fingertip. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the boy he had been, the way he used to run down these very stairs 2 at a time, the way he would call out, "Mom, are you watching?" before attempting some small act of bravery in the backyard. I had always been watching. I was watching now too, only this time the bravery required was mine. The hallway outside my room creaked lightly, and I heard Lily's steps pause near the staircase. There was a brief silence, as if she were considering whether to knock. She did not. Instead, her footsteps continued toward the living room. I stood and walked to the window. The lawn stretched out in the fading light, trimmed exactly the way Daniel liked it. The maple tree near the sidewalk swayed gently in the early evening breeze. Nothing in the yard suggested that anything had changed. The mailbox stood upright. The porch light flickered on automatically at 6:30, just as it always had. I realized then that Lily believed time moved forward simply because she decided it should. She believed that a sentence spoken in a hallway could undo decades of history. I sat down at the small writing desk near the window and opened the top drawer. Inside were envelopes, stamps, and a leather-bound folder. Daniel had given me 2 months ago. "Just in case," he had said with a half-smile, sliding it across the table after dinner. I had scolded him for being dramatic, but he insisted I keep it somewhere safe. I had not opened it since. My hand rested on that folder now, not with panic, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Downstairs, a car door closed in the driveway, followed by the faint vibration of an engine starting. I moved back to the window in time to see Lily's sedan pull away from the curb, her brake lights glowing red before disappearing at the corner. She had left the house without another word. The quiet that followed felt different from the earlier silence. It felt open. I remained standing there for a long moment, watching the empty street, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For the first time since the cemetery, I did not feel pushed. I felt still. And in that stillness, I began to understand that decisions made in haste often reveal more about the one who speaks them than the one who hears them. I closed the curtains gently and returned to the desk, placing both hands on the leather folder, aware that whatever Daniel had prepared inside it might not only change my circumstances, but redefine who truly belonged in this house. I sat at the small writing desk for several minutes before I finally opened the leather folder Daniel had given me. The house so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the hallway clock through the walls. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had expected trembling, or at least hesitation, but instead there was a calm that felt almost unfamiliar. Inside the folder were several neatly arranged documents, each placed in a clear sleeve as if he had wanted to make certain they would be easy for me to read. On top was a letter addressed in his handwriting. The sight of it tightened something in my chest, yet I did not look away. I unfolded the paper carefully and began to read. He had written it 3 weeks before he passed, on a Tuesday afternoon, according to the date in the corner. He said he knew I disliked serious conversations, that I preferred to believe in recovery and second chances, but he needed to make sure. I was protected. The word protected stood out to me. Daniel had always carried that instinct, even as a child. He wrote that the house was not as simple as it appeared, that certain arrangements had been made after his diagnosis became more certain. He asked me not to discuss anything with anyone until I had spoken to Mr. Robert Hayes. Seeing that familiar name grounded me. Mr. Hayes had handled our family matters since my husband Thomas was alive. Daniel trusted him. So did I. Beneath the letter were copies of documents that referenced a trust, the date of its creation, and signatures that I recognized. My own name appeared more than once. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer to the desk lamp, reading each line slowly. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear enough. The property had been placed into a living trust, and the conditions attached to it were not as straightforward as Lily seemed to believe. I felt no surge of triumph, no dramatic rush of relief. Instead, there was a quiet understanding settling over me, like the way dusk gradually fills a room. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed again, steady and indifferent. The house had not chosen sides. It simply stood, as it had for 24 years, holding the memories of every birthday dinner, every holiday morning, Every ordinary Tuesday when Daniel would sit at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and ask about my day. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the sleeve. Lily's words from earlier echoed faintly in my mind. The certainty in her voice, the assumption that my future could be reduced to a small apartment somewhere across town. I imagined her driving through the neighborhood at that very moment, perhaps already envisioning renovations, new furniture, a different arrangement of the living room where my late husband's armchair now sat. She had spoken as though the past could be cleared away as easily as a stack of old mail. I closed the folder and rested my palms against it, feeling the cool surface beneath my skin. Daniel had not been careless. He had not been naive. He had known more than he let on during those final weeks. A memory returned to me then, of a quiet evening in the hospital when he asked Lily to step out so he could speak. To me alone. His voice had been weaker than I wanted to admit, but his eyes were steady. He told me not to worry about practical matters, that everything was arranged. At the time, I believed he meant insurance forms and bank accounts. I did not realize he meant something larger. I rose from the desk and walked slowly to the bedroom door, opening it just enough to look down the hallway. The lights were off downstairs. The house felt vast and still. I knew Lily would return eventually, and when she did, she would expect compliance. She would expect suitcases by the door, perhaps even gratitude for her decisiveness. Instead, I closed my bedroom door once more, locked it gently, and placed the leather folder inside the top drawer of my nightstand. I did not need to confront her tonight. I did not need to explain anything. For now, it was enough to know that my son had seen further ahead than either of us, and that whatever conversation awaited us in the morning would not unfold the way she had planned. The house remained quiet long after I turned off the bedside lamp, yet sleep did not come easily. I lay on my side listening to the familiar sounds of the structure settling, the faint expansion of wood in the cool night air, the distant hum of a car passing 2 streets away. For years those sounds had comforted me. They meant stability. They meant home. Now they carried a different weight, as if each creak were a reminder that change had already entered through the front door. Sometime after 9 o'clock, I heard Lily's car return. The garage door lifted with its usual mechanical groan, then lowered again. Her footsteps moved briskly across the kitchen floor. A cabinet closed. Water ran briefly from the faucet. There was no knock on my door. No attempt at conversation. I imagined her reviewing papers at the dining table, perhaps making lists, perhaps deciding how quickly she could arrange for the house to be sold. The thought did not anger me the way it might have hours earlier. Instead, it clarified something. She was acting on assumption. I was acting on information. The difference between those two things is often revealed only with time. I rose from the bed and slipped on my robe, moving quietly to the window. The porch light cast a soft glow across the front yard. The maple tree near the sidewalk stood motionless now, its branches dark against the sky. Daniel had planted that tree when he was 22, digging the hole himself on a Saturday morning in early spring. He told me he wanted something that would outlast him. At the time, I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. Now the tree stood taller than the roofline, its trunk thick and steady. I wondered what he would think of the conversation that had taken place beneath its branches just hours after his burial. I returned to the desk and opened the drawer where I had placed the leather folder. I did not remove the documents again. I simply touched the edge of the folder to reassure myself it was real. Daniel's handwriting in the letter had not been hurried. It had been deliberate, as though he knew clarity would matter later. I recalled the evening in the hospital when he asked about Mr. Hayes, whether I still had his number saved in my address book. I had teased him gently, telling him I was not planning to draft a new will at 78. He smiled faintly and said, "Just promise me you will call him if you ever feel uncertain." I had not understood then how soon that uncertainty would arrive. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock at my door. It surprised me. I turned the handle and opened it to find Lily standing in the hallway, her expression composed but firm. She did not step inside. She remained in the doorway, maintaining a careful distance. "I assume you will begin packing in the morning," she said evenly. "It would be best if this transition were handled quickly." The word transition lingered between us. I studied her face, searching for any trace of doubt, but found none. "I will take care of what needs to be handled," I replied. My voice was calm, almost gentle. She nodded once, as if satisfied, and walked away without another word. I closed the door again and leaned against it briefly, feeling the solid wood at my back. She believed that decisiveness equaled authority. She believed that speed would secure her position. What she did not know was that arrangements had already been made, conversations already recorded in ink and witnessed. By law, I returned to my bed but did not lie down. Instead, I sat upright with my hands folded in my lap, watching the digital clock shift from 10:30 to 10:31. Morning would come soon enough, and when it did, the next move would not belong to the person who spoke the loudest in the hallway, but to the one who had prepared in silence. Morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light filtered through the curtains, soft and indifferent, as if the world outside had not shifted at all. I had not truly slept, only rested with my eyes closed, listening to the slow passage of hours. At 6 o'clock I rose, folded my robe over the back of the chair, and dressed carefully in a navy sweater and gray slacks. I brushed my short silver hair into place and put on my glasses. Routine has always steadied me. Downstairs I could already hear movement. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted up the staircase. Lily was awake early. When I entered the kitchen, she stood at the counter scrolling through her telephone, a ceramic mug beside her. She looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "I thought you might want coffee before you begin," she said, gesturing toward the pot. Her tone was polite, almost considerate, as though the conversation from the night before had been nothing more than a minor scheduling discussion. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table. The sympathy cards were still stacked neatly in the center, untouched. Sunlight reached across the hardwood floor, illuminating the faint scratches Daniel had once promised to refinish. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and took a slow sip. The bitterness grounded me. "I will need some time this morning," I said calmly. "There are a few calls I must make." Lily nodded once. "Of course. I only ask that you move efficiently. The real estate agent can come by this week." There it was again, that quiet certainty that plans were already in motion. I studied her face, searching not for cruelty but for conviction. She believed she was being practical. She believed grief required organization. What she did not know was that Daniel had anticipated this very moment. After breakfast, she retreated to the living room, speaking in low tones on the telephone. I carried my cup to the small desk in the corner of the dining area and opened my address book. The pages were worn at the edges, names written in careful script over decades. I found Mr. Robert Hayes listed under H, his office number unchanged since my husband's time. For a brief second I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the weight of what that call would set into motion. Then I dialed. The line rang twice before his assistant answered. I introduced myself, and within moments I heard his familiar, measured voice. "Margaret," he said gently, "I have been expecting your call." Those words settled over me with quiet reassurance. We spoke for several minutes. He confirmed what Daniel's letter had suggested. There were specific provisions in place, clauses designed to protect occupancy and prevent coercion. His tone was professional but kind. He asked if I felt safe and comfortable remaining in the home. I answered honestly that I did. When I ended the call, I felt neither triumphant nor vindictive. I felt prepared. Lily entered the dining area shortly after, her steps light but purposeful. "Have you arranged transportation?" she asked. I met her gaze evenly. "I have arranged a meeting," I replied. The distinction was subtle but intentional. She frowned slightly, perhaps sensing that something was not unfolding according to her expectations. The house remained still around us, the clock ticking steadily above the doorway. Outside, a delivery truck passed slowly down the street, ordinary life continuing without interruption. I realized then that this moment was not about confrontation. It was about patience. Daniel had trusted that I would not be easily displaced. He had known that silence, when backed by preparation, can carry more weight than argument. I folded my address book closed and placed it back in the drawer. Lily returned to her telephone, her voice tightening just enough to betray a hint of uncertainty. I finished my coffee, set the mug carefully in the sink, and stood. Morning had arrived exactly as it always did in this house. The difference now was that I no longer felt like a guest waiting to be dismissed. I felt like someone who understood that the next knock on the door would not bring removal, but revelation. By mid-morning the air inside the house felt charged, though nothing visible had changed. Lily moved from room to room with a quiet urgency, opening drawers, straightening stacks of mail, wiping down the kitchen counter as if preparing for an inspection. I remained seated at the dining table with a small notepad in front of me, writing down dates I remembered, conversations Daniel and I had shared during the past year, details that once seemed ordinary but now carried weight. The clock above the doorway read 9:42. Mr. Hayes had said he would stop by before noon. I did not mention that to Lily. She assumed my earlier telephone call had been about apartments or storage units. I allowed her to keep that assumption. There is a certain power in letting someone believe they are ahead. Around 10:15 she approached me, holding a slim folder of her own. "I have printed some listings," she said, placing the pages on the table. Photographs of small one-bedroom apartments filled the sheets, each image bright and staged, neutral couches beneath wide windows, tidy kitchenettes with stainless steel appliances. "These are within your budget," she added. I glanced at the numbers without comment. Monthly rent, square footage, parking restrictions. The word senior appeared more than once. I nodded politely. "You have been thorough," I said. She took that as encouragement and sat across from me. "It is better to act quickly," she continued. "The house will need to be evaluated, and it will be easier if there is no confusion about occupancy." Occupancy. The term sounded clinical, as though I were a temporary tenant who had overstayed a lease. I folded the pages neatly and set them aside. "There will be no confusion," I replied. My voice was even, almost soft. She studied me, perhaps searching for resistance, perhaps expecting emotion. When she found neither, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good," she said. "I will call the agent this afternoon." She rose and walked toward the hallway. I listened to her footsteps fade, then reached for Daniel's leather folder once more. I did not remove the documents. I simply ensured they were within reach. Outside, the late morning sun brightened the front yard. A neighbor across the street watered her flower beds, unaware of the quiet negotiation unfolding inside our home. At 10:48, a moving truck rolled slowly past the house, its engine rumbling before disappearing around the corner. The sound lingered in the distance. For a fleeting second, I wondered if Lily had already begun making arrangements, but the driveway remained empty. At 11:20, I heard her voice again, this time sharper, as she spoke on the telephone in the living room. "Yes, as soon as possible," she said. "There will be no complications." I allowed myself a small, private breath at that word. No complications. She could not yet see the clause Daniel had referenced, the specific language that addressed coercion and removal. She could not see the signature lines, the dates, the witnesses. At 11:35 a car door closed outside, firm and deliberate. The sound was different from Lily's vehicle, heavier, older. Through the dining room window, I saw a dark sedan pull into the driveway, sunlight reflecting off its windshield. My pulse did not quicken. Instead, a calm clarity settled over me. Lily paused mid-sentence in the living room, as if she too had heard the arrival. A moment later the doorbell rang, steady and unhurried. Lily stepped into the hallway, confusion flickering across her face. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the front of my sweater. "Yes," I answered. "I believe I am." The bell rang a second time, patient and measured. For the first time since the funeral, I saw uncertainty cross her expression. She moved toward the front door, her steps no longer brisk but cautious. I followed at a distance, the wooden floor cool beneath my feet. As she reached for the handle, the sunlight framed her silhouette against the glass. The house held its breath, and I understood, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that the next few minutes would not be shaped by assumption, but by the quiet preparation my son had set in motion long before this morning ever began. When Lily opened the front door, the morning light spilled across the entryway, outlining the figure standing on the porch in a dark gray suit. Mr. Robert Hayes looked exactly as I remembered him, tall, composed, his silver hair neatly combed, a leather briefcase held firmly in one hand. For a fraction of a second Lily did not speak. She glanced back at me, confusion sharpening into something closer to concern. "Good morning," Mr. Hayes said evenly. "I am here to see Margaret Whitmore." He did not step inside until invited. Lily hesitated, then shifted slightly to the side. "I am Lily Whitmore," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. "Is there something we can help you with?" He offered a small, professional smile. "I have come regarding Daniel Whitmore's estate," and the living trust documents executed on March 14th of this year. The air seemed to thin at the mention of a specific date. I stepped forward, my posture straight despite the weight of the past 24 hours. "Please come in, Robert," I said quietly. He nodded and crossed the threshold, removing his coat with deliberate calm. Lily closed the door behind him, the click of the latch louder than usual. We moved into the living room, where sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating the framed photographs along the wall. Daniel's image, taken at a family barbecue 2 summers ago, seemed to watch us from above the mantel. Mr. Hayes placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it without haste. Daniel anticipated that this would be a difficult time. He began, his voice measured. He asked that I personally review the relevant provisions with both of you present. Lily's fingers tightened slightly around the back of a dining chair. "I am his wife," she said carefully. "I am aware of his will." Mr. Hayes inclined his head. "This concerns the trust, which supersedes certain assumptions about sole occupancy and property transfer." The word supersedes landed with quiet authority. I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. He withdrew a set of documents, each page marked with tabs. "The residence is held within the Whitmore Family Living Trust," he explained. "Margaret Whitmore is designated as co-beneficiary with protected lifetime occupancy rights." Lily blinked, as though recalibrating. "That cannot be correct," she said softly. "Daniel told me the house would be mine." Mr. Hayes did not react to the emotion rising beneath her words. Daniel ensured that his mother would retain full and undisturbed residency for the duration of her life, regardless of marital status or subsequent decisions. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lily looked at me then, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time since the funeral. There was no anger in my expression, no satisfaction, only steadiness. Mr. Hayes continued, turning to a marked page. "There is also a clause addressing attempts to compel relocation under emotional or financial pressure. Such actions would trigger a review of inheritance distribution." Lily's composure faltered. "I was not compelling anyone," she replied quickly. "I was simply discussing practical arrangements." Mr. Hayes met her gaze calmly. "Intent is assessed by circumstance. That is why Daniel requested that I deliver this clarification in person." The sunlight shifted slightly across the rug as a cloud passed overhead. I felt the house around us, solid and unchanged, holding every word. Lily lowered herself into the chair opposite me, her posture no longer rigid but uncertain. For the first time since yesterday afternoon, the balance in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, simply factually. Mr. Hayes closed the folder and folded his hands over it. "Margaret's residency is secure," he said. "Any future decisions regarding the property will require mutual agreement under the terms outlined here." Lily's gaze drifted toward the staircase, then back to me. The certainty that had fueled her plans only hours earlier had begun to unravel, thread by thread. And I understood, as I sat quietly in the home my son had protected, that preparation spoken in ink carries a different weight than words spoken in a hallway. The silence that followed Mr. Hayes's explanation was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. It settled into the room like dust and sunlight, visible only when you knew to look for it. Lily remained seated across from me, her hands resting flat against her knees, her posture no longer rigid but uncertain. Mr. Hayes adjusted the stack of documents on the coffee table and turned one final page toward her. "There is an additional provision," he said calmly. "Any attempt to pressure or remove a co-beneficiary from the property may be considered a violation of fiduciary responsibility under the trust." The phrase fiduciary responsibility seemed to slow her breathing. She glanced at the paper but did not reach for it. I could see calculation in her eyes, the quiet effort to reinterpret the past 24 hours in a way that would not implicate her intentions. "I was not attempting to pressure anyone," she said carefully. "I was only trying to plan ahead." Mr. Hayes nodded without contradiction. "Planning is not prohibited," he replied. "However, occupancy rights are immediate and protected. Margaret is not required to vacate, nor is she subject to timelines set by any other party." The word immediate felt steady in the air. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap, not out of fear, but to steady the emotion rising beneath my calm. Daniel had not left me unguarded. He had thought beyond his own illness, beyond the hospital walls, beyond the quiet conversations at dusk. Lily rose slowly from her chair and walked toward the window, looking out at the front yard as if searching for something that might restore her footing. The maple tree stood tall beneath the late morning sun, its leaves stirring gently in the breeze. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice lower than before. Mr. Hayes closed his briefcase halfway, but did not yet latch it. "Now," he said, "the trust continues as written. Shared responsibilities remain in place. Major decisions regarding sale or refinancing require mutual agreement. There will be no unilateral actions." Lily turned back toward us, her expression composed but thinner, as though something had been quietly removed from it. "And if we cannot agree?" she asked. Mr. Hayes met her gaze evenly. "Then the property remains as is. The trust does not expire." That final sentence seemed to land with a weight that could not be argued away. I rose from my seat then, not abruptly, but with deliberate calm. "Robert," I said gently, "thank you for coming." He nodded once. "Daniel was very clear," he replied. "He wanted peace preserved in this house." The word peace lingered in the room long after he spoke it. Lily's shoulders lowered slightly, whether from resignation or reconsideration I could not yet tell. Mr. Hayes gathered his documents and secured the clasp on his briefcase. As he walked toward the front door, I followed at a measured pace. Lily remained near the window, her reflection faint against the glass. When the door opened, a rush of crisp air entered the hallway, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood late in the morning. A lawn mower hummed somewhere in the distance. A child laughed faintly 2 houses down. Life continued, indifferent to tension. Mr. Hayes paused at the threshold and looked at me with quiet reassurance. "If you need anything further, you will call," he said. "I will," I answered. The door closed gently behind him, the latch clicking into place with a sense of finality. I stood there for a moment, feeling the solid wood beneath my palm. Behind me, the house remained exactly as it had been yesterday, yet something fundamental had shifted. Not the walls, not the floors, the balance. Lily turned slowly from the window, her composure rebuilt but altered. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, there was no instruction in her voice, no timetable offered. Only a pause. And in that pause, I understood that protection does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in a briefcase, in measured words, in ink that was signed long before anyone thought it would be needed. After the front door closed and the sound of Mr. Hayes's car faded down the street, the house felt larger than it had that morning. Not emptier, not colder, just more honest. Lily remained by the window for several seconds, her reflection faint against the glass, as if she were measuring the distance between what she had expected and what had actually unfolded. I did not rush to fill the silence. I walked slowly back into the living room and adjusted the frame on the mantel, straightening Daniel's photograph by less than an inch. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it steadied me. "I did not know about the trust," Lily said finally, her voice composed but thinner than before. "He never explained it that way." I turned to face her. "He explained what he felt was necessary," I replied gently. There was no accusation in my tone, only truth. She crossed her arms loosely, not defensively, but as if holding herself in place. "I was trying to make practical decisions," she continued. "The mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance. This house is large. It requires planning." I nodded once. "Planning is wise," I said. "Assumptions are not." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. She looked at me then with something closer to recognition than resistance. For the first time since the funeral, she seemed to see not just an elderly woman in a worn sweater, but the person who had lived within these walls long before she ever stepped inside. The late morning light shifted again, brightening the hardwood floors and the staircase. Daniel had refinished himself. Every detail of the house felt deliberate, as though it too had been listening. Lily moved toward the dining table where the printed apartment listings still lay. She gathered them slowly, stacking the pages with measured precision. "I suppose those will not be necessary," she said, almost to herself. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and rinsed my coffee mug, placing it carefully in the drying rack. The ordinary rhythm of water against porcelain felt grounding. When I returned, she was standing near the front door, holding the folder of listings against her side. "What do you intend to do now?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question. I considered it carefully before answering. I intend to remain, I said. I intend to honor the arrangement Daniel created. And I intend to ensure that this house remains peaceful. The word peaceful lingered between us. She lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again with a steadier expression. I did not mean to create conflict, she said. I believe that part was true. Her urgency had not been rooted in cruelty alone. It had been rooted in fear of uncertainty, in the instinct to secure what she believed was hers before it slipped away. I understood that instinct. I had felt it myself when my husband passed years ago. The difference was that Daniel had chosen clarity over haste. Outside, a delivery truck stopped briefly in front of the neighbor's house before moving on. The world continued in its predictable rhythm. Inside, the air felt different now, not tense but recalibrated. Lily walked toward the staircase and paused at the bottom step. We will need to discuss finances, she said, her tone steadier. Utilities, insurance, property taxes. I nodded. We will, I answered. Together. The single word seemed to settle something unspoken. She ascended the stairs without another comment, her footsteps softer than they had been the night before. I remained in the entryway for a moment, resting my hand lightly against the banister Daniel had sanded smooth years ago. He had known this house would outlast him. He had also known that clarity, written in ink and delivered at the right moment, could protect more than property. It could protect dignity. I inhaled slowly, feeling the familiar scent of polished wood and morning light. The house had not changed. I had not changed. What had shifted was the understanding of who belonged here and under what terms. And for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel displaced. I felt anchored. The afternoon unfolded more quietly than I expected. Lily remained upstairs for nearly an hour, and I could hear the soft rhythm of drawers opening and closing, the faint scrape of a suitcase being shifted across the closet floor. She was not packing to leave. She was reorganizing, reclaiming, restoring a sense of control in the only way still available to her. I stayed downstairs and opened the windows in the living room, allowing fresh air to move through the house. The scent of cut grass drifted in from somewhere nearby. Ordinary sounds carried across the neighborhood, a dog barking once, a car door closing, the steady hum of distant traffic. Inside these walls, however, something fundamental had recalibrated. I sat at the dining table and spread out the household bills that had arrived earlier in the week. Electricity, water, property tax notice for the upcoming quarter. Daniel had always handled these matters with quiet efficiency, sitting exactly where I was now, calculator beside him, pen tapping lightly against the paper as he reviewed each amount. I ran my fingers along the edge of the tax statement and remembered the conversation we had last winter when he mentioned reviewing the trust documents again. At the time I assumed it was routine. Now I understood it had been foresight. Around 2 o'clock Lily descended the staircase. Her expression was composed, though no longer sharp. She carried a notebook and sat across from me without invitation, which felt like a small but meaningful change. We need clarity, she said. If you are staying, then we should define responsibilities. Her voice held no hostility, only caution. I nodded. Clarity is wise, I replied. She opened her notebook and began listing expenses, speaking each one aloud. Mortgage balance, insurance premium, lawn maintenance. She paused at that last item and glanced toward the front window where the maple tree stood steady in the sunlight. Daniel always handled the yard himself, she said quietly. I allowed a faint smile. He did, I answered. He said mowing it himself gave him time to think. For a brief second, shared memories softened the space between us. Then she continued, her pen moving carefully across the page. If the trust requires mutual agreement for sale, then we should at least establish written expectations for upkeep, she said. The word written did not escape me. Ink had already altered the course of this house once. It could do so again, this time with cooperation rather than conflict. I agree, I said calmly. We will consult Robert to ensure any agreement aligns with the trust. She did not resist that suggestion. Instead, she nodded, acknowledging that legal clarity had shifted the balance of authority in a way neither of us could ignore. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. We discussed shared utility payments, scheduled maintenance, even the possibility of repainting the guest room in the future. Each topic was approached cautiously, as though we were testing the strength of a bridge that had nearly collapsed. Yet with every measured exchange, the tension of the previous day loosened slightly. There were no apologies offered, none requested, only recognition that assumptions had consequences. As the sun began to lower toward late afternoon, the light in the dining room softened. Lily closed her notebook and looked at me directly. I did not expect today to unfold this way, she admitted. I met her gaze without triumph. Neither did I said. The honesty in that exchange felt more stabilizing than any legal clause. She rose and walked toward the kitchen to prepare tea, moving more slowly now, as if the urgency that had driven her 24 hours earlier had finally exhausted itself. I remained at the table a moment longer, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. Daniel had protected more than property. He had protected the possibility that conflict could transform into structure rather than fracture. I stood and joined Lily in the kitchen, accepting the cup she handed me. The steam rose between us, thin and steady. The house did not feel contested anymore. It felt negotiated. And in that subtle shift, dignity remained intact for both of us, even if neither would say so aloud. That evening the house settled into a quieter rhythm than it had known in days. The tension that once moved sharply between rooms now felt diffused, replaced by a cautious stillness. Lily prepared dinner without announcement, moving through the kitchen with deliberate efficiency. I remained at the dining table reviewing the notes we had written earlier, making small adjustments in the margins where clarity required it. The sound of vegetables being chopped carried through the air, steady and controlled. It reminded me of countless evenings when Daniel would lean against the counter beside her, sampling a piece of whatever she was preparing, offering light-hearted commentary about seasoning or timing. The memory did not wound me the way it had the day before. Instead, it rested gently, like a photograph placed back into its frame. When she set a plate in front of me, she did not avoid my eyes. "I spoke too quickly yesterday," she said after a moment, her voice even but softer than before. Grief does not always make people patient. I studied her face, searching for performance, but found only fatigue. "No," I answered quietly. "It does not." We ate in silence for several minutes. The simple act of sharing a table felt different now, not forced but reconsidered. Outside, the porch light switched on automatically as the sky dimmed into early evening. I noticed that Lily had left the apartment listings off the table. They were gone, removed without ceremony. After dinner, she washed the dishes while I dried them, an old rhythm returning without discussion. Our movements were careful but no longer defensive. At one point she paused, her hands resting in the sink. "I thought security meant control," she said, almost to herself. Daniel thought security meant preparation. The distinction lingered between us. I folded the dish towel neatly and placed it on the counter. "He believed in structure," I replied. "Structure protects everyone." She nodded once, absorbing that truth without argument. Later, I walked into the living room and turned on the small lamp beside Daniel's armchair. The warm light filled the corner of the room where he used to sit reading in the evenings. Lily stood near the staircase, watching the glow settle across the rug. "I do not want this house to feel divided," she said. Her voice carried less authority and more intention. I met her halfway across the room. "Then it will not," I answered. "But peace requires mutual respect." She held my gaze longer this time, and something unspoken passed between us. Not forgiveness, not complete understanding, but recognition. The balance had shifted permanently. She understood now that haste could unravel carefully built foundations. I understood that fear can disguise itself as decisiveness. We stood in the center of the living room, the air calm and unstrained. The maple tree outside cast faint shadows against the curtains, its branches steady in the night breeze. Daniel had planted that tree to outlast him. In a way, he had planted more than that. He had planted foresight, structure, and the quiet strength that prevented a house from fracturing under pressure. As the evening deepened, Lily ascended the staircase without urgency. I remained downstairs a moment longer, listening to the familiar creak of each step. The house did not feel contested anymore. It felt claimed in a different way, not through possession, but through clarity. I turned off the lamp and prepared for bed, aware that tomorrow would not require confrontation or defense. It would require continuity. And continuity, when grounded in truth, is stronger than any demand spoken in a moment of grief. The next morning arrived quietly, as most meaningful mornings do. Sunlight filtered through the dining room windows, soft and steady, resting across the table where Daniel once sorted bills and sketched plans for small home improvements he rarely finished. I woke before 6, not from worry, but from habit. For the first time in days, my chest did not feel tight. The house breathed in its usual rhythm, the faint hum of the heating system, the gentle tick of the hallway clock. I dressed slowly and made my way downstairs. Lily was already in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a kettle warming on low heat. She glanced at me as I entered, and there was no tension in her expression, only acknowledgement. "Good morning," she said. It was a simple greeting, but it carried something new. "Good morning," I replied. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked toward the front window. The maple tree stood tall against a clear blue sky, its branches reaching outward with quiet certainty. Daniel had planted it with his own hands, saying he wanted something rooted and lasting. I understood now that he had been thinking beyond the soil. He had been thinking about us. Lily joined me near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The street was calm, a neighbor walking a dog along the sidewalk, the sound of distant traffic steady but unobtrusive. "I was afraid," she said finally, her voice low but honest. "After the funeral, everything felt unstable. I thought if I acted quickly, I could hold something in place." I nodded gently. "Fear often speaks first," I said. "But it does not always. Speak wisely." She exhaled softly, not in defeat, but in understanding. The silence that followed felt different from the one that had filled the hallway days ago. That silence had been sharp. This one was settled. We moved back to the dining table and reviewed the notes we had written the afternoon before. Responsibilities were outlined clearly. Shared expenses were defined. There were no raised voices, no accusations. Only structure. When we finished, Lily closed the notebook and looked at me directly. "Daniel trusted you," she said. "He trusted that you would remain steady." I allowed myself a small smile. "He trusted that this house would remain steady," I answered. "That is not the same thing." She considered that, then nodded. Later, as she prepared to leave for an appointment, she paused near the front door. "We will make this work," she said, not as a promise made under pressure, but as a decision spoken with clarity. "Yes," I replied. "We will." When the door closed behind her, I did not feel alone. I walked into the living room and sat in Daniel's armchair for the first time since the funeral. The fabric was worn at the arms, shaped by years of use. I rested my hands on the wood and looked around the room, at the photographs, the shelves, the familiar imperfections in the paint along the baseboards. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I had not been removed. I had not been silenced. I had remained, not through argument, not through force, but through preparation and patience. The house felt anchored again, not because ownership had been defended, but because dignity had been preserved. Outside, the maple tree swayed gently in the morning breeze, its roots deep, its branches steady. Daniel had ensured that what mattered would not be easily uprooted. And as I sat there in the quiet light, I understood that sometimes the strongest response is not resistance, but remaining exactly where you belong.